My name is Matt LaCroix. I'm going to present today a 200,000 year timeline about where we've been, how far back we've gone based on everything that I've studied. And I want to point out that the purpose of this presentation is going to be to build up and show you some evidence that really points towards why I think where I place certain things on this timeline make the most sense. And in some cases, the evidence that we have to show where something fits can be really difficult to find. It can be almost non-existent because of how many cataclysms and how much of human history has gone through empires controlling and destroying evidence, locking it away in places like the Vatican archives, where it doesn't fit into this normal narrative that we've been taught through both a combination of, in some cases, religion, and in some cases, this Rockefeller doctrine of human history. So let's start from the beginning here. We're taught that all of human history falls into a 6,000 year period, roughly. We're taught this narrative. This is what we're given in school when kids go into classes and they open their books, they get this history. And then they try to show how everything fits into this little narrative. And that all of human achievements have occurred only in this 6,000 year period. And that's all there is to it. And I remember being in school and being incredibly bored by this version of history that we're taught. It just seemed so mundane. There was nothing interesting about it. Apes came along and slowly evolved into hunter-gatherers, and then all of a sudden they just discovered mathematics, they discovered farming, they discovered creating laws and rules and building all these incredible structures. We're told it came out of nothing. We know that just isn't true, that if you really do look at what the evidence is, you get a completely different viewpoint that really challenges this narrative. And I think that's why it's so important. Some might say, what is so important about caring about this ancient past? But I think what it really does is it connects the entire history and understanding of who we are, our place, and really what's happened in our epic that defines who we are. And without understanding our past, we're really destined to repeat it. Now, why has there been so much confusion with human history? What happened that caused so much of it to be destroyed and lost? If you were to go to places like, look at the Osirion in Abydos, Egypt, or go across the world through South America and look at places like Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, what you find with a lot of these ancient structures is that they're scattered all over the place. And in many cases, they're destroyed. Pieces are lying everywhere, strewn everywhere, and you say to yourself, what happened to that ancient culture? Why is there so much destruction seen on a lot of these ancient structures? And one of the things that kept coming up in my mind was I was always someone who was fascinated by geology and climatology, fascinated by it. And when I used to learn about where I live here in Maine and the fact that there was 2 miles of ice above my head where I'm talking right now, only 10 to 11,000 years ago, that much ice, it really makes you have to reimagine what kinds of cataclysms could have been possible when you got those shifts back and forth like that. I remember scratching my head when I would learn about things like, at the end of last ice age, all of these mammals all across the northern hemisphere of the planet just disappeared. Giant beavers and sloths and saber-toothed tigers, they all disappeared, and we're given these multitude of different reasons about why that happened, and those are known as the megafauna. And we're told that climate was changing a little during that, and there was the hunter-gatherers were harvesting too much and they were killing too many animals, and we accept all these different pieces of information to piece together, if we had an ice age only 11 to 12,000 years ago and we had a massive die-off of megafauna right after it, we need to start paying attention to, what happened during that could have caused that? And this is really what I think leads down this rabbit hole of understanding human history, because the way that I connect all of this is when we look at ancient texts across the world, especially stories that come out of Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets, which we're going to be going into ancient Vedic, Indus Valley civilizations, Hindu cultures, talking about these great disasters that occurred and how there are these different epics of human history in between. When we're looking at that timeline, like I showed you before, that we're told in school, there wasn't any disasters like that could have caused this massive destruction like we're told, until you go outside the box and you start saying, okay, well, I'm going to go in with an open mind and I'm just going to be objective. As difficult as it is, I don't really trust this story anymore. There's too many holes. There's too many gaps. And so what I'm going to do is just be objective and lay down some foundations. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to lay down some pieces of evidence and some foundations to understand what has happened in our past. And the first thing that comes up is that, well, we're told by cultures, all ancient cultures all around the world, some even indigenous cultures, which would point to the fact that they're older than we're told, because what they say, all of them, is that there was this great flood, this great set of cataclysms that occurred in our past. And a lot of them were either warned, or in some cases they weren't warned, to seek shelter during these events. And because of them, it led to the entire destruction of what is known as the lost civilizations of human history. And we're going to go into some of the evidence that shows that. Now, what I'm presenting on the screen right now, for those who don't know, is one of the only pieces of evidence that really concretely points to what these events were that were occurring on the Earth over the last 20,000 years. And this is only a 20,000 year snapshot. Keep in mind, we're going back 200,000 years today. But what it shows is that over the last 10,000 years, we've had relatively stable climate. When you think about, the little ice age during the medieval period, you find out that thousands and thousands of people died from crop failures, and entire human civilization moving forward was slowed down to a halt during that time period. If you look at the graph, what was known as the little ice age was almost a tiny minor blip in terms of looking at climatology. Now, what you're essentially looking at in terms of 20,000 years is an ice core sample that's taken from Greenland. Greenland is one of the last places in our northern hemisphere that has had ice all the way back at least 20,000 years. So it gives us a snapshot of relatively what was going on with our climate during this time period, because that's directly dependent on these different empires rising and falling in the different epics of human history. And so what we find in this period that is known as the Younger Dryas is these sets of massive rises and dips in temperature. And this is what's known as the order of magnitude in terms of how powerful the events were because of these changes. So when we think about all these disruptions, like I mentioned before, in relatively recent human history, the last couple thousand years, it's almost nothing. It's just a blip on the radar compared to these events that happened during the Younger Dryas. And like I mentioned, with these megafauna disappearing all across the northern hemisphere, start to make sense that so this wasn't because of human impact with overhunting and just because of simple climate changes in terms of like thinking of it as droughts and extreme rains. No. We're talking about massive cataclysms that occurred over a multi-thousand year period on our planet because of our planet going through different phases that I'll explain soon. I think most of that has to do with solar output. And so what happened? Well, we had all that ice, like I mentioned, 2 miles of ice above my head. But instead of slowly melting over thousands of years, it just rapidly melted. And I mean, within 100 years melted, and in many places. And because of that is one of the contributing factors that led to what I believe was considered the Great Deluge. And we're going to go into this more as we go along, but I want people to wrap their heads around how destructive this time period is. And then as we go into the evidence that proves that these ancient civilizations are older and predate this time period, which helps for us to place where things fit in this entire timeline. So what we're looking at now is one of the very first photographs, black and white photographs ever taken of the Sphinx and the Great Giza complex. And what you find that's so interesting about it to me is that, look at it, it's almost completely buried. Half of its body is buried in sand. And the point I'm trying to get across is that this is very much how evidence shows that what we think of as the dynastic Egyptians found it as well. It's not as if this is just the remnants of one time period. We're talking about multiple epochs of human history that have come and gone because of disasters that occurred and other influences as well. And we'll get into those influences and how those changed over time. So the first piece of evidence that we can concretely place some of these information, some of these places, is let's look at a place called Gobekli Tepe in the Anatolia region of Turkey. What makes Gobekli Tepe so important is that it gives us a date to work with, a date that greatly contradicts with the dates that were given for when human civilization reached a state where it was sophisticated enough to have things like agriculture and astronomy and understanding mathematics and advanced building practices and all those different things that go into being able to create what was considered an ancient astronomical temple. And what they were doing with this temple, if you look at what's on each stone, each monolithic stone, you find that there is a symbol of some kind of an animal, some kind of a creature. And a lot of people immediately jump to the conclusion that they were talking about some animal that was on the planet that during that time. But what you really find when you look at the depictions of what they have, things like a scorpion, you find that it's an astronomical calendar of the heavens. They're talking about different constellations. And so we're looking at an advanced temple basically mapping the heavens. And what are they looking for, right? It's not just that they were trying to understand the constellations moving in the sky so they can know more about themselves. It was actually much more complicated than that. What they were tracking was known as the zodiac ages and the changes of the precession of the equinox. Why they were so obsessed with that? Well, you find that in cultures all around the world that built these types of temples that have to do with certain locational proximity to, having constellations of stars and perfect north and south alignments. What they're doing is they're tracking the heavens. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, what you'll find out as we go along here is that when we were showing you those ice core samples, these cataclysms that occurred 10 to 12,000 years ago, you find out that is maybe a cyclical thing that may happen every single between 10 and potentially as long as 20,000 years. But the date that seems to be coming up is about every 12,000 years. Something seems to keep happening when potentially our sun goes from a solar maximum to a minimum or a minimum to a maximum. And think about it. 12,000 years ago, almost right now, we had basically a massive ice age covering the entire northern hemisphere, and that was during a solar minimum. And then what happened? Going from a solar minimum to a maximum, disaster and cataclysms occurred. All the ice melted, our Earth warmed up, and before long, we were into a completely different cycle. And I think we're going through the opposite of that right now as we go from a very warm planet to eventually what's going to be a cooling coming up in our future. So as I was saying before, Gobekli Tepe makes us have to scratch our head because it gives us a date for this astronomical temple, this temple that maps the heavens. It gives us a date that's more than double the age of when human civilization was supposed to be that sophisticated to have that type of knowledge. That's what's so important about this. So you have the first question is, well, is Gobekli Tepe the only ancient site that has a date that's totally different than what we're told? And the answer really is that all around the ancient world, as I stated, from Peru to Lebanon to Iran, all the way to Japan, India, we find this sophisticated building that is completely it'd be completely impossible to. And for those who don't know what the Mohs hardness scale is, in that timeline I showed you at the beginning, that 6,000 year timeline of human history, we have these different ages. The Bronze Age, okay, ages that move on to industrial ages, and in those ages there's certain technologies that are present for those people. And during what we're told was the ancient Mesopotamian world in Iran and Lebanon, what we're told was the Bronze Age, okay, according to our books. Now, the problem with that is, according to the Mohs hardness scale, Bronze Age tools wouldn't be able to carve these types of rocks because most of them are granitic and they're very, very hard. They have a higher number on the Mohs hardness scale than the tools that they were working with. And that means that it would be impossible to cut them into these incredible sculptures because you would basically just be pounding on something and you would break your tool. You wouldn't even be able to get anywhere. But instead, we have this incredible building all around the ancient world, as I said. It is in some cases like the bottom right on the slide I'm showing, that's Sacsayhuaman near Cusco, Peru. And instead of blocks being put on, it almost looks like they were somehow melted and put together in a very strange type of complex that goes even beyond what we're talking about here. What kind of technology could have even done that? Because we can't even do that today. And I think that's what echoes all throughout a lot of these ancient sites, whether or not it's ancient Egypt with the great pyramids, the Osirion, looking all the way down through the megalithic structures like outside Karnak and down through Luxor and down into looking at the obelisk, the unfinished obelisk. All those structures would have been impossible for what we think of as the dynastic age of Egyptians to carve because it's too hard for those types of tools. That means that those structures were built much, much earlier during a period that I call the lost civilizations, when certain technology was present for these ancient cultures, and then because of cataclysms, that knowledge was eventually lost, and we went, in many cases, we went backwards. We went backwards in time, and we're only relearning now what they already knew well over 10,000 years ago. And I think that's why the timeline that I'm going to be presenting here is so important, because we got to try to age this. I get so many questions from people saying, well, when was Atlantis around? When was Eridu around? When were the Indus Valley civilizations created? And so that's where we're going to try to piece all of this together. We're now in Peru. And Peru contains some of the most incredible megalithic building in the world. Megalithic means very, very large stones. And why that is so important is, in my opinion, Machu Picchu, which I'm showing here in examples, one of the most famous sites in the world, is what I consider to be the easiest site to recognize different time periods of ancient cultures. Now, we're told that the ancient Inca, but the ancient Inca as in, only 3,000, 4,000 years ago or less. Some estimates are something like 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, as we're told in our Rockefeller history books, that they created these structures. Now, what the problem with that is, as not only do we have the Mohs hardness scale problem with tools available during that time period, but it's plain as day when you actually know what you're looking for to see the differences. Now, what's so fascinating about Machu Picchu, and I talk about this site all the time, but I think it's so important for us to look at this site because it helps to really piece together us saying, here is a location that is so obvious with the different building styles that it almost screams out, look at this, look at the differences. Now, on the screen here, on the left, you see some incredible megalithic building that is so tight together you can't even put a sheet of paper between it. And what you'll notice on the edges of the rocks sticking out are these types of knobs, which is very strange, right? Not only would that be extremely difficult to carve, but why would they need an ancient knob on the edge of that rock? Now look on the right side of the screen and at the very top. Notice the size of the rocks, the cobble that's used to build on against these structures. It's very small. It's almost unorganized. It's just little pieces of stone that with small amounts of mortar. You look at how precise is the building, how large are the blocks, and did they use mortar? In the megalithic world, they were so sophisticated and precise that they used no mortar at all. And in fact, we don't even know how they shaped these rocks in the first place. So what this shows you is, what we think of as the Inca were part of what may be a much, much older culture that the indigenous called the Viracotians. Tiki Viracocha was considered one of these gods that apparently came out of Lake Titicaca, according to their stories, and provided them with all of this knowledge. So over and over and over again, we keep getting these stories about how long ago we had these sophisticated cultures that then mysteriously disappeared. And what happened was, think of the later Inca, like we're told as the Inca, emerged out of the rainforest, the Amazon rainforest, and found these structures all over the mountaintops, in some cases strewn all over the place. And they found what was most likely some kind of information that would help them piece some parts of it together. They might have even been contacted by what they were considered back in the ancient world gods or entities that seemed to reside in the higher dimensions up in heaven, as the term that was later used. But all we know is they tried to mimic those ancient structures the best that they could, building right on top of them, but they were unsuccessful. It was very primitive. But that's what's so fascinating about this, because if we're told that the timeline goes back in a linear fashion, that the older you go, the more primitive it is, Machu Picchu is the perfect example to be the smoking gun in the room to prove that wrong, because the most sophisticated building is on the bottom, and the more primitive buildings on the top, which means it's completely backwards. And that's the larger narrative that just keeps coming up all over the ancient world. Now, this next one I've talked about in a few of my shows, and it's in my latest book, but it is another one of these smoking guns, in my opinion. And most people have never even heard of this. And if you have, I think it's great that you're researching this, because it's all about thinking outside the box. In 1958, a farmer near Lake Titicaca, right in the heart of this ancient world, and for those who don't know, Lake Titicaca is one of the highest elevation lakes in the world, and it's also one of the deepest lakes in the world, which is interesting when you talk about the underworld and connecting way down beneath the earth, which is what a lot of these stories talk about, with this emerging Tiki Viracocha god coming out of it. So along the banks of Lake Titicaca, further to the west, we have Ollantaytambo and Sacsayhuaman and Cusco and Machu Picchu, like I mentioned, a lot of these incredible sites. And then closer to the lake, we have these bizarre sites in a much different type of style known as Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, where these blocks have been created in these giant H structures that is so precise that we could still not do it today. Razor sharp, where you could actually run your finger along some of them and cut your finger. And we're talking about something that, if we go along with this narrative of these destructive events, looking at the ice core samples, they have to be older than 12,000 years ago, which would be incredible to consider that they're still sharp enough to be able to cut your finger and not even be able to slip a piece of paper through. That is incredible advanced sophistication. Now, in 1958, getting back to what I was saying, a farmer was plowing his field near Lake Titicaca, and he, all of a sudden, at the front of the plow, unearthed something that popped up to the surface. He went over to examine it, and what he found was a bowl that had these very strange inscriptions inside it. And when he brought this to the attention of archaeologists and historians in the area, they were astonished. Some of them were astonished, because what they found out was that the etching inside the bowl matched cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia. Now, they realized, these ancient cultures, that the only way you could preserve a message was to etch it into clay or stone and then bake it, and then you would have this message preserved within it. Rather than writing on a piece of paper or even trying to paint on a wall, those would disappear over time. So cuneiform became the only way to be able to leave behind a lasting message. Now, what's so fascinating about that is Mesopotamian world is thousands of miles away. And we're told in our Rockefeller history books that the indigenous cultures slowly migrated through the Bering Strait and came down through North America. And hey, look, Inca was the last ones to be developed, right? Totally backwards. The whole story is backwards. The Inca are actually the oldest culture in the Americas, because they were directly connected to ancient Egypt and also ancient Mesopotamia, and I'll explain it, the entire cycle is all connected by the same influences. And so this bowl, all the way thousands of miles away, supposedly, as we've been told, disconnected to that world of Mesopotamia, we find this cuneiform writing on a bowl. And that, to me, is proof that these cultures had influences that were connecting all across the world, and that these Mesopotamian cultures are much older than we've been told as well. And you'll see that, obviously, as a repetitive theme, is that a lot of these ancient cultures are much older, and there's different time periods even within them. So what we think of as the Inca, well, there's different epics of what we think of as the Inca, as I was describing before. This is where my greatest interest, I think, lies in terms of ancient texts. For those who know me, I love cuneiform tablets. It's incredible to me that the style of writing, the sophistication behind it, and there's no writing, in my opinion, besides perhaps the Bhagavad Gita or looking at the ancient Hindu writings that can go back as far as Mesopotamian writings do. Were there Incan writings that are now gone because they were stolen by Pizarro and the Catholic Church? Maybe. We don't know what's in the bottom of the Vatican archives, stolen from the Americas. But what we do have pieces of left to show this evidence is found within cuneiform tablets. And I'm going to have to speed up because I'm a little behind here, guys. So cuneiform tablets give us this lost story from the past because the Sumerians in the ancient Sumerians, as we're going to get into specifically, they realized that they could preserve these ancient stories that could live on for thousands and thousands of years in the future. And we have those stories today, and we get this glimpse of the past because of them. Now, the screen I'm showing are some of the most famous of all. The one on the left is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The one on the bottom right is Genesis. And some of those tablets give us a glimpse into the past that's completely different than we've been told. And in some cases, it blows your mind because it describes so many different things of human history, from the origins of mankind, totally different than an evolutionary standpoint, to ancient gods that were handing down all this wisdom and these laws and rules and mathematics and agriculture to these cultures, to great struggles that occurred within them and even destruction of those cultures. It was all preserved in these messages. In 1849, Henry Leonard came to Iraq and was exploring the ancient Iraqi ruins, and he found this incredible ancient library that predates what we think of as the Library of Alexandria by thousands of years. And this library, buried underground, contained 30,000 cuneiform tablets. And so Austrian Henry Layard realizes he's got this incredible catch of rare text, and he sends them to the University of Oxford, where we have some experts, Syriologist experts, that then later translate them. Now, this is where the waters get a little muddied. A lot of people have come forward saying, well, those translations were not done correctly because of some writings that have been potentially mistranslated, some sections by certain authors. And I'm not going to name who those are. And that doesn't mean that one author is wrong on everything and one author is right. What you find is that there's a lot of different interpretations for a lot of these texts because this language died out thousands of years ago, and people didn't know how to read cuneiform because those cultures that came later couldn't read it either. So you're looking at a lapse of thousands and thousands of years where nobody could read this dead language. And so there was only a handful of experts that had been trained in what's called the Syriology to be able to translate them. And the one that I've mentioned many times that is so important for us to understand is a man named George Smith. After Austen Henry Layard had brought these tablets to the University of Oxford, George Smith, in my opinion, is a great hero because he is the all-time historical expert on this dead language. He mastered it. And George Smith started to translate these, and he started with the Epic of Gilgamesh. And as he translated them, he realized he had this story that was talking about great heroes and great epics and destruction in our past. And he knew he had something extremely important. And so when I went into this, going through the internet and reading books, I wanted to know the truth because these tablets blew my mind with the information, the stuff that they contain, talking about these ancient gods known as the Anunnaki. And to me, there was all this conflicting information, people saying that the Anunnaki wasn't real and it was just a mistranslation by one person. And so I became determined, and that was what one of the great focuses of my latest book, The Stage of Time, became, was not only research and find out the truth of these ancient Mesopotamian stories, but to record the most important of them in text. And that's what I did in The Stage of Time. I put many of these ancient texts, the translations that I felt were the most important, in the books with an index so people can read them for themselves. Translations that were done by a combination of George Smith and later Stephanie Dalley, who took George Smith's work, almost 100 years later and verified most of it, which to me is the other smoking gun in the room to prove that what we're told is just a myth, and that is all these unconnected myths is actually very real. And it goes back and it gives us this lost story. And so that's where we're going to be placing a lot of these tablets and the information they contain. I want to just point out before I get into it is this is a changeable document. This is a moving timeline. A lot of this stuff that's the dates and the places where things are, it's evolving as information and evidence is interpreted differently or looked at in a different way, or even new evidence comes up from some new archaeological discovery. We have to constantly be objective and open-minded to saying, oh, okay, this actually fits somewhere else. And so before anyone jumps on some of these, I encourage everyone to go do your research. And if you think that some of these should be somewhere else, show me what the piece of evidence that explains that is. And I will absolutely update this. And I provided this on my website, thestageoftime.com. And it's something that I want to keep evolving until it's perfect. Because I think this is so important for us to be able to map our history. It's our legacy. What happened in our ancient past? Where do things fall? Where do they lie? So the first place I want to start is to go over some of these major dates and just lay them out there. And what you'll see is I present a 200,000 year timeline, and I'll go over each piece of evidence that explains where that fits. Okay, thank you. And it's not even necessarily something where we have a lot of evidence for it, but there's pieces of evidence that explain it. And so that's where a lot of this information came from. Now, if you look on the right, I want to start on the right side of the screen first. Look at the 6000 BCE, and I don't use the old term. I like to call it before current era or common era. That's a lot more sense to be able to place all these dates instead of having to incorporate, when Jesus was born and all those different, Christ was born and all those different things. So in that, again, that Rockefeller history book that we're taught in school, if you look on the right side, that all those, where there's only a couple events, right, from 6,000 years to where we are now, you just have a couple little things in there. You have the Roman Empire and the Library of Alexandria, and there's a lot of things that did happen during that are important. But the important thing to point out about it is that all these other events and things that occurred, these incredible accomplishments like the Great Pyramids being built, they don't fit into that little timeline. The evidence behind it points to something much greater, much older, and that's where we're gonna get into putting some of these and placing them. So where we start is roughly 200,000 years ago. I kept it 200 to be clean, but if we were to actually look at some of the evidence, it may be a little older than that. But this is a ballpark, and that's what I want to reiterate with this. It's a ballpark of where these roughly were. So what happened? Well, in the Sumerian king list, one of these incredible cuneiform tablets that came out of Mesopotamia, you find this list of these Sumerian dynastic rulers that had these astronomical ages of hundreds, if not thousands of years. And when we look at that and we try to wrap our heads around that, it almost seems like it's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. Our lifespans are only 120 years, roughly at a max right now. So how come we keep seeing all of these stories all the way from the Book of Enoch and looking at how old Enoch was supposedly his age, to looking at the Sumerian king list? We find that a lot of these ancient rulers lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And I think the first place we need to start is, okay, well, is that just one place that it says that? Or does it actually say that in multiple places? And when you go in and you look at the ages of all these different ancient texts that place these rulers, they always show these ages that are in hundreds of years. And in the thing that I think about every time I hear that is, okay, so we're talking about these lost civilizations. Because it seems like there was a certain genetics, there was a certain type of bloodline that existed in these ancient kings and these ancient rulers that's no longer around today. Something happened to us, and we started to live less and less time until we only lived about 100 years now. But that wasn't always the case. Going all the way back to these tablets, they state, when we look into the ancient story of when mankind was created, this Adapa origins, the myth of Adapa, it states that they were ruling for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that Adapa, where does he fall into this list? Well, according to the Sumerian king list, if you add up all the dates in that, you get a little over 200,000 years ago. Okay, and so that's one place where we can place this. I want to go to the next date of 12. I'm going to jump to 12,000 BCE. We know during that, and I put it right above it, the younger, driest Earth changes. Why? Because we have ice core samples from Greenland that show that there were these periods of incredible cataclysms over thousands of years that led to megafauna dying all over the northern hemisphere, and the ice caps rapidly melting, and volcanoes and pole shifts, and all of this incredible stuff that happened. Well, we know that it landed there because of ice core samples, and we can find periods of incredible instability with layers of ash and coal from great fires that lay in a certain layer in the ground, and that just like a tree ring, we can then say, okay, so we can place that in these disasters. And so what we do is we keep placing these little what I call these anchor points of what we know is real, and then we can try to put everything else around it based on what that evidence is. Now, the next thing I want to point out is that, well, when we go into places like our Common Era and the Romans, we know that the Romans and the Egyptians, they already found these structures buried up in sand and destroyed. So it means that they're much younger. Okay. So let's go through this, and I'm going to try to explain the evidence behind each one and why it fits where it does. Now, I already explained the Sumerian king list and the dynasties of Lagash, Eridu, Bad Tabir, and Shuruppak. But what other evidence is there besides that? Well, in multiple tablets, the myth of Adapa and Eridu Genesis and into the Sumerian king list and several others, it mentions that Eridu is the first city ever created on Earth. And not only that, but it's where the biblical Eden was located, where mankind was created. Okay, so then if we look into researchers like Lloyd Pye, who looks into the genetic differences in our skull structure, our skeletal structure, in our genetics going back, wow, we can see that there's this missing link where our brain size doubled during this certain time period of around 200,000 years ago. It's this strange window where all of a sudden there were these more primitive Neanderthal Denisovians, and then all of a sudden the brain just jumps and doubles in size, and we sophisticated human civilizations just emerge. Okay, so we can take that 200,000 year date based on geneticists like Lloyd Pye and the Sumerian king list and a lot of these other ancient writings, start with around a 200-year timeline. Then we can work backwards. Now, you see I have on there after Lagash, Bad Tabir, and Shuruppak, which are cities listed way before the flood, and are ancient cities, like in the Epic of Gilgamesh mentions. We find that there's evidence of a more sophisticated civilization than even that emerged, called Atlantis. And I know this is the one that probably the most people are interested in, because it's the one that the most people have researched on a broad basis for lost civilizations. And what do we know about Atlantis? Well, we only have a couple little pieces that prove that Atlantis was real. One of our greatest philosophers in history, obviously Plato, and many people know this, in the Timaeus and Critias, he talked a great deal about this ancient culture, civilization called Atlantis, that was once connected all around the globe potentially. And this culture achieved such a sophistication that in some ways these cultures and ancient civilizations like Atlantis may be more sophisticated than we were. Not necessarily on a case about like looking at computers and cars and what we think of as technology, smartphones, but they had a completely different type of knowledge and technology back then that was about understanding the cosmos and understanding the nature of reality, their world around them. And I think that's how they were able to achieve building this incredible sophistication, because they were given that knowledge that was handed down, according to the Mesopotamians, by these deities or entities that seemed to reside in higher dimensions and came to this realm. According to the Nag Hammadi, ancient Gnostic text, these entities, these superior entities to us, came here and they found this realm and they decided to create mankind in their image. And that's why this whole jumpstart story starts, is that we were jump-started and created in their image, and we became like gods here. And that was where the challenge became, because we became too sophisticated and we were basically almost reset to be able to control and organize this reality again. So Atlantis, well, Plato describes this incredible ring of circular islands with great description, I might add. Some would say, well, it's just a metaphor for, cultures, and it wasn't a real place, and it wasn't really a time. It was more explaining on a symbolic way. But he actually, I want to point out, he actually goes into great detail describing the amount of islands there are, how big they are, the amount of water around them, and also its relative location. Somewhere southwest of the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, somewhere in the North Atlantic, somewhere Western Africa area, where this incredible civilization emerged and was likely connected all around the world. And that's where I want to connect this. Is it's not just about Atlantis. Atlantis seems to be part of this ancient lost world that was connected and with a lot of this ancient megalithic building. Now, some would say, well, if Atlantis was so sophisticated, why don't we have any writings left behind from them, right? Why do we only have cuneiform tablets? Why isn't there anything left that talks about Atlantis? Well, the only thing we have, and some obviously have conjecture towards it, is the emerald tablets of Thoth that came out of Egypt and then later in the Americas. And I really do believe that if you read those yourself and you go into piecing those pieces together, it really does connect to really make a lot of sense with trying to explain this. He goes into Thoth, and that goes into great description about how the central island was known as Undal, and all these different names for the city of Kiora, and all these other relatable pieces of evidence that really connect to a lot of this other information. Now, getting back to why there's no writings for Atlantis, in terms of something that actually goes into detail, like a catch of rare cuneiform tablets type of thing. Look at what we do to keep records now. We consider ourselves a very sophisticated civilization, and yet our only records are paper, sometimes written into stone, but in most cases just digital. What would happen if we had a solar outburst that flipped the poles and causes cataclysms all around the world? How long would it take before we were just a distant memory, and maybe another culture came after us and didn't think we were real because there was nothing left over from it? I think they would think of us as the plastic civilization, where we destroyed our planet. But would there even be anything left? I think that's the real question. And I think that's what we can wrap our head around with Atlantis, because according to Plato, he says that Atlantis was destroyed in a series of violent cataclysms where nothing was left over after on. It's basically sunk into the ocean and there was nothing left over from it. And so it could make a lot of sense that, okay, so we don't even have those structures left from where Atlantis was. Of course we don't have anything left that it gives more detail on it, because it's gone. It was wiped out. So we should feel happy with whatever pieces of evidence we have and try to go off it if we're objective, we know it's real. Well, what we find in the emerald tablets of Thoth is that after Atlantis was being destroyed by cataclysms, there was a mad rush to try to balance our planet and preserve this information and wisdom. So before Atlantis was destroyed, I think there was foresight in this whole entire process of these cycles of destruction. And in terms of, the sun going through these changes and our galactic changes and all the things that happened, they knew. That's why Gobekli Tepe was mapping the cosmos. They were basically keeping track of when these things were going to happen, which is why it's so fascinating that if you look into the history of Gobekli Tepe, you find that it was deliberately buried. Like they knew that the only way to preserve it was to bury it. And some have even gone as far to say that the amount of work that it took to bury it might have even been more work than it was to create it. That shows how important it was to preserve it, just like all these ancient texts like the Nag Hammadi and the Book of Enoch, how they were hidden and kept in caves so that we would once finally know the truth about all this. Now, getting back to it, like I said, before Atlantis was destroyed, according to what the only piece of evidence we have is that a great civilization was created in the Nile Delta called Kemet or Kem. That was the name of Egypt before the modern day Egypt. And they created these incredible pyramid structures that we find pyramid-like structures in other places across the world too. And it really begs the question of what were those structures for? Because we don't find pharaohs buried in them. That's a complete lie. They were told to hide their age and truth about when they were built. Now, what other evidence do we have, right? It's not just the emerald tablets, because some even don't even believe that those are real. Well, for those naysayers, you get the hard evidence behind that is found in a couple places, and I'm going to quickly go over that. The first is the enclosure around the Sphinx. Now, around the enclosure of the Sphinx, what we find is a geologist, when they go look at that, is there's extreme weathering that's occurred along the edges of that. extreme weathering of the rock where there's gully marks strewn through it. Now, from what we're told in our history books, the Great Pyramids of Giza were built somewhere around 4,500 years ago, okay? Yet the erosion marks around the edges of it don't match the climatology during that time period at all. We didn't have any heavy rain that could have created that type of erosion. So when did we? That's the question. When you take ice core samples from Greenland, boom, going back to that again. When you look at the climatology for those time periods, we find that we didn't have substantial rains that could have created that kind of erosion, until before 10,000 years ago. That's one piece of evidence. The second thing, inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, we find what's known as the King and Queen's Chamber. Now, above the King's Chamber, there are megalithic blocks of granite that have been raised 300 feet up in the air that weigh more than 60 tons. We're talking about SUV after SUV after SUV piled on top of each other, and with the amount of weight that could have been created. That's megalithic building. Boom, there's another piece of evidence, meaning that it had to have been created earlier. Now, the King and Queen's Chamber points towards certain constellations, okay? The King's Chamber and Queen's Chamber represent feminine and masculine energy, and they represent looking into the afterlife, in the afterlife of our consciousness and where it may go. And that's why the King's Chamber points to Orion, and then we look at the Queen's Chamber, and it points to Sirius in the Canis Major. Now, there are a lot of important things that go along with this, and we're not going to have time to go into all of them. But the bottom line is, when did those constellations line up with those air shafts, those shafts? They didn't do it during 4,500 years ago. They didn't do it 5,000 years ago, 6,000, 7,800, 8,000 years ago. They did it over 12,000 years ago. Some have even stated, based on the way that the Sphinx is facing, it may even have been 30,000 years ago. That's why the date of when they were built is a movable thing, but at least we can place it in a certain area that it fits, and that is before 12,000 years ago. Now, what happened? Well, that ancient civilization that built all those incredible structures like the Osirion and Abydos, which is down below ground, and everything above it is more primitive, claim for building these had nothing to do with their building. They simply inherited them and tried to put in writings on them to claim them. And they had nothing to do with them at all. And that's why we're talking about these different epics that came along. Now, I've already gone to the next one. Well, what about the Indus Valley civilizations? Well, I want to just quickly go over a new piece of evidence that I've never talked about that is really amazing. I got to give credit to my lovely wife, Colleen. I really feel honored to have a wife where I can sit down and research ancient history with her. And that's why I give her credit, because she was researching one day and she came across a tablet I've never heard of and I've never had anyone ever talk about. And the tablet is called Enki in the World Order. And I highly recommend people check that out. And in Enki in the World Order, this Mesopotamian tablet, it mentions specifically Eridu right in the very beginning, and it mentions Enki, this ancient Anunnaki god, and Inanna. And the whole premise behind it is that Enki is having discussion with Inanna, these god deities, where Enki is in charge of creating domains where they rule over, when they rule over those civilizations that are there with their influences. And Inanna is unhappy because of the domains that she has. So the story is talking about how Enki is describing the regions that she has and saying, Inanna, you have so much already. Why are you complaining? Now, why is that so important? Because in that tablet, it is the only piece of evidence I've ever seen to connect the Indus Valley civilizations and the Saudi Arabia-Iran area with ancient Mesopotamia, all the way across into places like Cambodia with Angkor Wat, because of the influences of those writings that you find. What it says in that tablet is that Enki is describing the regions that these domains are, and he's describing the trade between them. He's describing the influences that occurred when Eridu was around. Where does Eridu place? Look at it on the map. Eridu in these ancient Mesopotamian cities were around up to where I have Atrahasis. Atrahasis, the tablet is placed there because he's the ancient flood king who, from Shuruppak, see the city of Shuruppak I have listed, he's the last king who ever ruled Shuruppak. And he talks about in great detail this great flood that destroyed and wiped everything out. everything away. And he says that Shuruppak was the last city where these ancient gods once came in physical form and then disappeared. And they left during the Great Deluge. And Atrahasis was a great flood hero who later became the biblical version of Noah. Now, that's how we get to place that stuff in a certain vicinity, because Atrahasis, also known as Untapishti in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he is a great bloodline king that connects all the way back to these early kings. And that's why he's so important, because he's got their ancient bloodline that allows him to live for so long. So Atrahasis talks about how Shuruppak was the last city that was destroyed in the Mesopotamian area before his time, and essentially he was one of the only ones that survived it. Yes. I was just answering a question for Chris. So in the tablet, Enki and the World Order, he's talking about that during the time of Eridu and these other ancient cities in Mesopotamia, there was trade and information, and cultures were connected from two locations he calls in the tablet. I've never seen this mentioned anywhere else before in any piece of evidence. He says in it, he mentions specifically the region of Dilmun, Dilmun, and the region of Malhala, or Muluha, Muluhha. Okay, and if you do research on Dilmun, you find out that it's the region of Saudi Arabia and Iran. Why is that so important? Well, if you go look into all these incredible, massive rock reliefs and these gateways that have been created in Saudi Arabia and Petra, Jordan, and all the way across in Iran, looking at Persepolis and Nashi Rostam in the Fars province, these giant doorways that I showed earlier in one of the slides, right in the rock, it's part of the same sophisticated building that we find with a lot of these other cultures, like all the way across the world in Peru. This precise building, Emru Muru, is a giant gateway in Peru. Same type of technology we see in building in Saudi Arabia and Iran. So this is why this is such an important discovery, because the Enki and the World Order tablet mentions the region of Dilmun as being directly connected with knowledge and influence to Mesopotamia. Why is that important? Well, because we're told that where these places fit in our human history, that those of each other. So then what about the region of Muluhha? Well, this region is even more important to it's as important to me, but it's in some ways it has different types of styles that I want to bring up. In the region of the Indus Valley civilizations, Muluhha, go look up the region of Muluhha, and you'll find out that it's a region of Western India. Okay, now if we do a little research on India with this idea behind megalithic civilizations and lost civilizations, go look into places like Kanhari Cave, Elephanta Cave, Bara Hill Caves, Kailash Temple, and Ellora Caves. These are all incredible structures built right out of the sheer walls of these ledges. Now, these ledges are made out of what's known as basalt, one of the hardest rocks we have. Getting back into that Mohs hardness discussion I had early on, Bronze Age tools would be impossible to create these incredible places. Look into Kailash Temple in Ellora Caves. It's one of the most incredible megalithic single cutouts of a rock structure ever built in the world. It's basically an entire mountain that was cut into one giant temple. And that would have been impossible with Bronze Age tools from this timeline we're given. And so that's why this is so important that Enki and the World Order mentions this region of Dilmun and Muluhha, because they're basically, and I apologize if I'm getting that name wrong, they're basically mentioned in there as being all connected with this knowledge. And that's why when we see the building practices where all these sophisticated building was done, it all makes so much sense, that they were all connected at one point. And then on the list, of course, we have the Pre-Inca and the Olmec and the Aztec, and same thing. Look in the Olmec culture in Veracruz, we find these giant stone heads that have these characteristics very much of Africans, coming as they came through, traveling west from like the Dogon and from Egypt all the way across into the Americas. And I think that's why we have a lot of this Egyptian influence in places like the Americas. And I already mentioned Gobekli Tepe that's on there, because we have dates on it. Now, this is where the date's very important that I point out. Lost civilization date at 10,000 BCE. This is just a rough estimate, but during this period of around 12,800 to 10,000 BCE, we had multiple cataclysms, and that's the most important thing to point out. It wasn't just one cataclysm. It was multiple cataclysms that seemed to come and go and affect different regions at different times. So they were shuffling and running around the world trying to build pyramids to balance the poles of our planet with the certain energy centers and trying to stabilize these cultures and then pass their knowledge to be protected. But they kept getting destroyed. And before long, once we get to past 10,000 BCE, much of it was gone. Now, how do we know that? I got to speed up here because I know I'm running out of time. Well, the legend of Etana, this king, talks about he is specifically the architect of the very first city that's ever created after the Deluge. Okay? That's important. That's another clue. He says that he created the city of Kish is the very first city ever created in the New World. And that's why I call it the Second Age of Sumer. It's the second development of this Mesopotamian culture that came after this destruction. It was tried to be recreated again. Gilgamesh, I think, falls into that same time frame because Gilgamesh, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, talks about how he went to seek the advice from the great flood hero Atrahasis, meaning that he came after the flood. That's how we know. He went to talk to Utnapishtim, Atrahasis, about how to obtain immortality. And Atrahasis has this great story for him about how Shuruppak was an ancient old city that had gods once there and all this stuff. And Gilgamesh is one of the last time periods of what I call the Second Age of Sumer, when there still were these bloodline kings connected all the way back to the beginning. How do we know that? Because Gilgamesh is shown on ancient murals and depictions as a giant, as a very, very tall person with a lion on his lap. And the lion has a full mane. And if you look into lions, you find that a lion with a mane has to be a mature lion. So it can't be this little pup, this young lion in his lap. We know that it's a mature lion. And well, it's tiny. It looks the size of a house cat. So therefore, we know that Gilgamesh was a great hero as part of one of these great bloodlines, and that's why in the story of Gilgamesh, he ends up connecting to the gods, and they talk to him. They say he's in their favor. Well, that's when all of this sophistication of this. Well, then what the heck? How do you connect the Epic of Gilgamesh with like Ashurbanipal? Where does that connect? Well, that's where the other nugget of evidence comes in, because in Ashurbanipal's library, you read about Ashurbanipal, you find out he was a great priest king of Mesopotamia, but he was not part of these tall bloodline kings from before. He was part of dynasties and important heritage of them, but he wasn't a giant, because he specifically talks about how when he amassed the Ashurbanipal library, he had his forces in his army go all over Mesopotamia to all these ancient ruins. And he called them specifically, said that these tablets were ancient when he went to amass them in the great library of the Ashurbanipal library. He already says that they were ancient. And that's how we know that there were these distinct different periods. So what happened? Well, somewhere around 8,000 BCE, there was some kind of a major climate change that didn't have to do with the Younger Dryas. Something else that during the Holocene that had to do with some kind of a massive dust storm or some kind of collapse in Mesopotamia. And the agriculture that they were so focused on to feed and fuel these civilizations seems to have collapsed. And we had another disappearance of this old world. And that's what I call the Third Age of Sumer. And that's why there's so much confusion when you try to piece all this together, because we're told that all of those different eras all occurred in this tiny little window. But really, they were separated by a great distance and incredible cataclysms in between them. Then we get into, so there, 4,000 BCE, we finally get to the dynastic Egyptians that we think of. And by then, look at how much time has already gone on. And they find all these ancient structures and they try to take ownership over them. And guess what? Even they disappear eventually. Because the Romans conquered them. And then before long, there's even sand built up, and then they seem like they're just a distant memory. You see how this keeps going on and over again? Every time one of these time periods goes on, there's a big gap in between it where another culture tries to take credit for it to seem like they're the ones who created it. Now, I'm at the very end here. Finally, you see where the Roman Empire fits into all this, who later went on and conquered much of the ancient world. And they're the ones who then birthed these empires that went around to the Americas later on and then stole all these artifacts and then controlled this entire narrative. That's where it all started with the Romans, controlling religion and controlling the narrative to fit into this whole model. And we are really the remnants of that Roman control today. We're part of that that military empire that controls people using fear and works off of an artificial timeline and narrative that doesn't fit in with evidence, and then hides all the other evidence and calls us all conspiracy theorists and calls us all crazy and lumps us into this little window of society and then makes us seem like there's something wrong with us. But really, we're one of the only ones with our eyes open. And so I just want to say I appreciate everyone that has an open mind and tries to look outside the box to see where this all fits.